Dark Souls is a game that people play. When they play, they have to fight bosses. Boom! The bosses of Dark Souls are some of the most recognizable in gaming, but when the first Dark Souls came out, no one had really fought a Souls-like boss before. Let's look at how all three Dark Souls games set up expectations with their first boss. Dark Souls 1, in my opinion, is the best starting area, the Northern Undead Asylum. It's dark, creepy, and abandoned. You open the doors to the boss arena and are met with the first boss of the whole series, the Asylum Demon. He serves as more of an aw shit moment than an actual lesson. You end up running past the boss into another room where you get a more useful weapon, fight two regular enemies, and make your way to the top of the asylum. From this position, you can re-enter the boss arena from above, plunging attack, and then whittle down the remaining health to kill the boss. A general theme of the first Dark Souls is that while many of the bosses are physically imposing, they are not super difficult. They're on average the biggest, but a general theme of Dark Souls is that the size of the boss usually makes it easier to kill. The Asylum Demon follows this trend, being big and scary, but is ultimately taken down by a gimmick mechanic, which only appears on the very next boss. I think Dark Souls was still in its phase where it felt the need to stand out, using moments where the player's jaw would drop, even if the bosses did not meet the expectations set up by their size. Dark Souls 2 doesn't really even have a starting boss. When you arrive in things betwixt, you think that a boss will be straight ahead, but in reality that just results with you arriving in Majula and you starting your adventure. The game intends for your first boss to be the last giant, but if you're like me, it was the Dragon Rider. The last giant is big like the Asylum Demon, but proves to be even easier. The Dragon Rider is smaller and actually a decent boss if he didn't fall off the map by himself. Dark Souls 2 is not really trying to tell the player anything with its first bosses. The statement, if anything, is, hey, you like Dark Souls? Well, there are more Dark Souls here. The game assumes that you have played the first one, and you don't need another introduction to the bosses. Of course, Dark Souls 2 is not really Dark Souls 1, but it is definitely more similar to it than the third entry. Dark Souls 3 is fast. While Dark Souls 1 was directed by Miyazaki, Dark Souls 2 was directed by two people who don't have hyperlinks on Wikipedia. When Dark Souls 3 came around, Miyazaki was back as director, and armed with the knowledge from working on Bloodborne, made a Dark Souls that was smoother, faster, and vicious. This game does not mess around. The bosses are truly out for blood. With Miyazaki reinventing the series, it needed to be introduced to both new and old fans. This resulted in the series once again having a boss in the starting area. Ludwig's Gundyr is fast, aggressive, and surprising. He's probably the smallest of the starter bosses, at least in the beginning, but uses a smaller size to ram the player with non-stop attacks. This boss is to tell new players what they've signed up for, and returning players that the new Dark Souls is very much different from the last. The boss fight also introduces the idea that bosses will have two phases, which players will reach after either draining the boss of half its health, or having bosses with 2 health bars. This opening boss is by far the best of the 3 games, opening players to the mechanics of the game, while still providing a bit of spectacle. Overall, the games show a shift where Dark Souls becomes focused on level design to bosses. Dark Souls 1 bosses are not that hard. Dark Souls 2 bosses are even easier. Dark Souls 3 bosses are hard. This is very much illustrated through the boss fights shown in this video today, and by Dark Souls 3, the From Software team had a clear understanding of how to do the first boss. So if you're making a first boss for a game that's hard, easy, a puzzle game, or any type of genre, make sure you have a boss that represents that. Maybe just don't use a regular enemy as a boss. Thanks, Elden Ring.